today. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm Heidi from SUPER, Students United for Palestine Equal Rights, here at PSU. Just a quick little plug, you don't have to be a student to join if you haven't signed up. Go ahead. Wael Elasady here with us. He's going to be talking about the revolt and humanitarian intervention in Syria. And let me just give you a little bio on Wael. He's pretty awesome and amazing, but just cut it down to this. Wael was born in Damascus, Syria. He is a student activist here at Portland State University, and he is co-host of the KBOO radio program, One Land, Many Voices. In addition, Elasady is co-founder of Students United for Palestine Equal Rights, sits on the board of Americans United for Palestine Equal Rights, Human Rights, and is a member of the International Socialist Organization. Just kind of the format for today, we're going to have Wael speak on Syria, and then we want to have kind of a discussion, sort of like panel. But let's save our questions until the end of Wael's talk, and then I will take about 3 people at a time so we can kind of have a dialogue going. It's much more conversational, much more informational. With that, here's Wael.
Thank you. Note to self, don't decide to give a talk on a subject as complex as Syria that's evolving on a daily basis at the same time that you're helping to organize a conference of this size. But it was actually something that I've been wanting to do for a while, largely because I've had connections to Syria, as Heidi mentioned, and I have a lot of family there. And because it's a debate that we're seeing in the media and also among Syrians, Muslims and Arabs generally in this country, and that's actually very polarized, that's very emotional, and I think it's in a lot of ways we have a very schizophrenic conversation about Syria that's happening right now. In one sense, what we get on one side of the equation, in the way that Syria is typically portrayed, the revolution in Syria, the revolt, is actually portrayed and this is usually by the Syrian regime itself, some of its allies, this is not a real popular revolt. It never has been. It never was. That in fact, from the very beginning, this was in fact armed gangs that were a tiny minority of sectarians slash Salafis, extremists, who are bent essentially on cleansing the ethnic minorities of Syria upon taking power. And the portrayal of this as a popular revolt is in fact a universal conspiracy. This is what the regime calls it. That's orchestrated by the U.S., Israel, Turkey, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. And that it's being portrayed as a revolution by Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera, other Western media outlets, and that the real reason for that the uprising, for why this is happening, is in fact to overthrow what the last bastion of quote-unquote Arab resistance to Western imperialism in the region, that is Bashar al-Assad's regime. Typically connected with this is the charge that all supporters, all those who have who are supportive of the revolution or the revolt, are in fact seen as either dupes of the West, or at best, or at worst, the way they're portrayed in Syria itself, as willing participants in this conspiracy. On the other hand, we have the Western portrayal that we do see in the media of what's happening of Syria, and in this portrayal, this is a this has been, and this is starting to change a little bit because I think the facts on the ground are becoming too obvious, but this has been simply a peaceful revolution that's had, that sectarianism doesn't play any part of whatsoever, and that and I think most detrimental, that the only way to save this revolution is by an intervention by Western or NATO forces to actually save the Syrian revolt and bring democracy to the region. So these are the two types of the way that things are framed right now. And it's also well worth mentioning that the second portrayal by the Western media also includes the charge that those who are worried about intervention or are against Western intervention are, in fact, dupes of the Assad regime or just simply supporters of this vicious dictatorship and its policies. And I wrote this talk specifically to try to help clarify what's happening in Syria and provide a framework that actually can help us here in the United States best provide solidarity to the people of Syria. Now, to start this off, I think because one of the things that's being put forward about what's happening in Syria is that this isn't an indigenous revolution, that this isn't part of the Arab Spring in some way, in some quarters. I want to start by actually framing what's happening in Syria within the context of the Arab Spring, within the context at least of the revolutions that have occurred over this past year. And there are some very specific, you can kind of point to 5 things that most of these revolutions have in common. One of them being the effects of neoliberalism in the region. That is, policies towards a move towards open free market capitalism that have created huge wealth stratification. We saw that obviously in Tunisia and in Egypt as well, and across the Middle East. We've seen high unemployment among the youth, especially educated youth in large part, that has actually moved these revolutions and pushed these revolutions forward. We've seen a crisis of international capitalism that's actually accentuated all of these things and pushed the populations over the edge, if you will. Of course, within that framework, we've seen in all of these revolutions high levels of political repression and regimes that have histories of political repression and corruption. And then finally, we have seen in these different revolutions a spark. In Tunisia, of course, we saw the self-emulation of Mahmoud Bouazizi. In Egypt, it was actually the victory of the Tunisian Revolution that was that spark. And so this is another aspect that we see in these different revolutions. And really, you can call this, a recipe for popular unrest. It's kind of like a cocktail. You can shake them all together, and you get yourself an Egypt. You can get a Tunisia. In the context of neoliberalism and high unemployment among the youth, you actually get revolts in places like Greece. You get the Occupy movement. So it's not even regional. We can look at this from an international perspective. So does Syria actually fit within this framework? And I think it's very clear that Syria is within that. The first is, I think actually all these ingredients exist in Syria. The first is neoliberalism. What has been the history of neoliberalism and free market, quote-unquote, reforms in that area? To talk about that, I want to just go back very quickly and just give a very short and brief history of Syria, starting with Hafez al-Assad, who's the father of Bashar al-Assad, the way that he came to power. Hafez al-Assad came to power actually in a coup in the 1970s, what was termed a corrective movement. And this was actually a coup that was done in opposition to a leftist leadership within the Ba'ath Party. The Ba'ath Party is the party in power in Syria, and had undone, that undid some of the state-led capitalist policies and the social welfare elements that the previous regime had done from 1963 up until 1970, when the Ba'ath Party came to power. And very quickly, Hafez al-Assad began to open up, not in a large way in the 70s, but in very small ways. He began to allow the opening for private capital, for the merchants of Damascus and Aleppo to actually have, to be able to have their enterprise. And it was really done in a way to move that regime to have a social base within the middle classes and the capitalist classes in the major urban centers, and to actually make sure that the regime had a social base, because the previous 10 years before that had actually been typified by coup after coup after coup after coup. This process was actually accelerated in the 1990s, both as the pressures of international capitalism really began to weigh on Syria, as the state-led capitalist program there began to stagnate and the economy suffered, as well as the Soviet Union, Syria's largest ally, also fell apart in the 1990s. So in the 90s, we actually see a loosening in what was called the N-10 law that was passed in 1991, which loosened restrictions on foreign investment and allowed for a five years worth of tax and custom fee exemptions for any foreign investment coming into the country. And that was extended again throughout the 90s. And when Bashar al-Assad came to power in 2000 upon the death of his father, this process was actually deepened. In a lot of ways, one of the main imperatives of Bashar's regime was to provide economic liberalization of the Syrian economy, with the promised political liberalization that was to go with it. That never happened, but the economic liberalization actually went forward. In 2001, Law N-28 was passed, and in 2005, there was a decree N-43 or something like that, which lifted the monopoly over the banks by the state in Syria, as well as insurance systems. And this is also a time where we see a stock market which was created and then opened in 2009 in Syria. Along with this opening of the Syrian economy and these neoliberal policies, we also saw a removal of price controls on major commodities in Syria, as well as cuts in oil, food, and farming subsidies for things like animal feed and pesticides, which had caused inflation to soar in Syria by 15%. And I've actually witnessed this as I've gone back. Prices in Syria have actually increased year after year in a very large way. And of course, income has not kept up to pace in Syria with that increase. This has actually been accelerated by a coincidental drying up of oil revenues in Syria, which for a long period accounted for nearly 2/3 of Syrian exports. So the neoliberal aspect has certainly been there in Syria, and the stratification of wealth that's occurred as a result of it. The level of high unemployment of the youth, does that exist in Syria? First off, it's worth saying that in Syria, actually 50% of the population is under the age of 18. 48% of all those unemployed are actually younger than the age of 30. So these revolutions that we see in Tunisia and in Egypt with unemployed, largely educated youth in the streets are also present in Syria as well. And in Syria, this has all actually been made even worse, the process, by a long 5-year drought that has hit Syria, that's absolutely devastated agriculture in the area and really lessened the level of wheat production and commodity production, so that Syria has had to import more and more food, just as the prices of commodities across the world with the economic crisis have actually increased. So for instance, the price of wheat soared over 100% in the year preceding the revolution. 32% of Syrians are now living on $2 or less a day. And of course, the Syrian regime recognizes these fundamental causes for the revolt that they have on their hands. The first attempt to actually appease demonstrators included a promise to halt neoliberal reforms, promises to actually halt cuts to subsidies, and this kind of symbolic increase to wages. And they also announced a 55% increase in Syria's budget for 2012. Now, this is make-believe. It's not a real increase. It was simply done for rhetoric. Even the Syrian finance minister had to come out and say this increase is just due to technical changes in the way we do accounting. But nonetheless, it shows that the regime understands these as the fundamental reasons for the revolution and has tried to move to take away some of those reasons. Unfortunately, those kinds of reforms have been very symbolic or non-existent. The real way that the regime has moved to actually deal with the revolt is through political repression, the other recipe for, that we've seen for revolution in the Middle East. The political repression and the police apparatus of the Syrian state is pretty notorious. Just some more mild examples, for the years leading up to the revolution, Facebook and YouTube had been blocked. When the revolution was intermittently, they'd stop and go. When the revolution began, text messages, especially in the areas with the largest level of protest, were blocked. As the revolution continued, interestingly enough, the Syrian Revolt decided we're going to unblock Facebook and YouTube actually because the activists are using proxies and we can't track them down that way. So they unblocked it at the same time that they created a network of hackers called the Syrian Electronic Army to track down activists, arrest them, torture them, and so forth. Also, as a side note, which is really interesting, the regime also purchased a surveillance system to monitor emails and internet use through Italy. But this email system was this monitoring system was made by Hewlett Packard. So you have a representative, Christopher Smith of New Jersey, has actually made a proposal now. He put in the House of the Senate of the House of Representatives to restrict the sale of surveillance technology services overseas, with the obvious notion that we should only be selling those here at home to monitor our activists here. Of course, the more serious form of repression takes the form of the mukhabarat, the Syrian internal services. They number in the tens of thousands in Syria, and they're comprised of multiple agencies, sometimes that are actually put in competition together, so no center of power emerges there. They are ubiquitous in Syrian society, in universities, in workplaces, in trade unions, and in fact they spread rumors to say that they're in places that we don't know if they really are in. For instance, most Syrians believe that taxi drivers in Syria are on the paid list of the mukhabarat. It's not clear if that's true, but this kind of this is encouraged because it creates a general atmosphere of intimidation and fear. And the mukhabarat are very open in a way in Syria, in the sense that you know when mukhabarat are there. And since the start of the revolt, especially in the main centers, where they're trying to keep the revolution, the revolts from spreading, they wear dark black jackets. And of course, thousands have disappeared. By some estimates, up to 30,000 Syrians have disappeared, and many have actually been held in Syrian jails for political reasons for decades, going back into the 70s and 80s. And of course, the largest symbol of Syrian repression in recent memory is the Hama Massacres of 1982, in which the Syrian regime cracked down on what was an uprising by the Muslim Brotherhood that was armed, but actually ended up leading to the death of 10 to 25,000 Syrian civilians in the city of Hama. So the level of repression is obviously there in Syria as in others. Real quick, I want to touch on corruption, because this has also been a huge characteristic of the revolutions in the Middle East. People in Syria for the longest time used to use the term Mr. 10% to refer to the big head officials of the military services under Hafez al-Assad's regime for the previous 30 years. And the reason they referred to these heads as the 10% was because of the commission that they received, 10% commission that they received for every contract between the state and a wealthy Syrian. today, after the opening up of the economy, these neoliberal policies, the term 10%, Mr. 10%'s changed a little bit. For instance, they actually, now the term that's used is Ulad al-Sulta, or the sons of the officials, is the term for the corruption that occurs there. And they're the ones that have received the name Mr. 10%. These are the actual sons or close relations of the regime that aren't directly involved in the bureaucratic, in the actual state, but are getting wealthy off of it. For instance, Mustafa Tlass, who was the defense minister in Syria from 1972 to 2002, his son Faraz Tlass is at the head of a commercial empire in Syria. Then you have Rami Makhlouf, who's probably the most reviled figure in among these wealthy in Syria. And he's owner of Syriatel, which and other ventures that are up to $6 billion is his estimated net worth. And Mr. 10% today actually refers to the percentage, not of the commission they're receiving, but the total percentage of the economy in Syria that they have control of. And finally, it's worth talking about the last aspect of some of these revolutions and how it's played out in Syria, which is the spark. What was the spark that really gave movement to all these pent-up social grievances that have developed over this 30-year period, essentially? And it's worth, you know, in Syria, when the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia had happened, the talk was that Syria would never move, that the Assad regime was too strong, and that nothing would happen. And in reality, at first, there wasn't very large protests. Some people tried to go out and protest in Damascus, and the protests were very small. They were very quickly repressed. But it was actually an incident that happened in Daraa, which is a city about an hour south of Damascus, actually, in which 15 boys between the ages of 10 and 15 were detained for drawing graffiti on a wall that said, "Al-Sha'ab yurid isqat al-Nizam," which is the people want the overthrow of the regime. Things they had seen, obviously, on television from the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. I better hurry up. Okay. And they were arrested. They were actually detained under General Atif Najib, who was the cousin of Bashar al-Assad, so a direct relation to the regime. And they were beaten, bloodied. They had their fingernails pulled out. The families of the arrested boys actually went to the to the governor of the area to protest and demand the release of the children. They were actually fired upon and sent home. And with the boys still in prison, and as the families in Daraa heard about this, the protests very quickly grew in size and in frequency. And as the protest continued, the killings and repression of the protesters also continued. On March 18th, security opened fire on a demonstration which had been calling for an end to corruption and the release of the children. So these were the early slogans of the revolution: an end to corruption and the release of the children. When the children were released, because of these increased protests, after having spent 2 weeks in jail, the marks of torture were clear on their bodies, and this fueled even larger protests. Very quickly, you had rallies in Daraa that were numbering, and the largest one estimated between 100 to 150,000. I saw several YouTube videos of this. It's worth keeping in mind that Daraa is the city that's only the size of 900,000, so a very large portion of the population participating in these. And I'm going to move on. So that was the spark in Syria. Very quickly, as the regime went into and laid siege to Daraa and tried to stop the protest there, this is what led to the spreading of the revolt elsewhere. And the one last part I want to mention here, I kind of highlighted it, but that the demands actually in Syria, as in a lot of other places, had largely been for reforms in Syria. And it wasn't until the regime really began to use high levels of violence that these began to change to demands of the overthrow of the president. It's also worth pointing out a few differences with the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia that have given what's happening in Syria kind of its uniqueness. One is that the economic distress and the economic policies of neoliberalism affected more than anything the rural areas combined with that drought. So we actually see a concentration of most of the revolt in the peripheries of the two major urban centers. The regime was very careful to maintain a higher level of investment in Syria in cities like Aleppo and Damascus. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is the political repression in Syria has actually been worse over the past years than we've seen in Egypt and Tunisia. In the sense it's been more total and dominating. This has left virtually no organized opposition to speak of inside of Syria. The Muslim Brotherhood, which was an organization that was very well organized and relatively tolerated in Egypt, was completely dismantled in Syria, sent into exile after the 1980s, and chased into countries. Also in the 1980s, and that crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, of course, Hama Massacre took that opportunity, cracked down on the Marxist, leftist, and nationalist groups, and also forced many of them into exile or threw them in jail. And in 2001, there was a very short movement called the Damascus Spring. Right when Bashar al-Assad came to power, the thought was that he was going to allow these political reforms. It was a very short-lived activity. It was mostly intellectuals that participated in it, kind of disconnected from the masses. But the important note to note there is that the repression that followed that sent many of the remaining activists into exile. So that's, I think, a very important aspect. There's no independent trade unions or trade union activity in Syria, very different than what we saw actually in Egypt. Many people think Egypt was simply Tahrir Square. Tahrir Square obviously played a large part in Egypt, but Egypt had massive general strikes that were occurring in its industrial sectors, and that had a history of actual resistance in Egypt. You had movements actually that began in solidarity first against the Israeli attacks on the West Bank in early 2000s. You had a protest movement that protested the Iraq War in 2003. And that protest movement also grew in size as Israel bombed Lebanon, and then with their vicious attack in Gaza. In 2006, there was actually a very huge strike in Mahalla al-Kubra in Egypt, which is the textile center. It has one of the largest factories, actually textile factories in the world, that employs 30,000 workers that went on strike. This history of activism and resistance did not exist in Syria. And that's played a large role, because in Syria there isn't organizationally, there are no political organizations that have the experience, and of course there are not a higher level of activists that can help push the revolution forward. It's also worth talking about the geopolitical history of Syria and what that's meant to the revolution. As I mentioned earlier, the Assad regime, Syria has been put forward as the pillar of resistance to American imperialism and to Israel in the region. And while I don't think these claims really hold light under close inspection, nonetheless, I don't want to talk about that right now, but I want to say that this is a critical question, regardless of whether it's true or not, in the minds of Syrians themselves, considering the history of the region, and especially considering their neighbors in Iraq. Syrians watched the United States occupy and control Iraq. There is very heavy resistance to any kind of to that kind of event taking place in Syria. Of course, Syrians have also been bordered with Israel, who has occupied the Golan Heights for a long time. So regardless of what the regime's record on resistance to imperialism is, the Syrian people very much are very sensitive to these issues. And this has allowed the Assad regime to brand from the very beginning the opposition as conspirators with American and Israeli imperialists to some degree of success. The last part or another part that's worth mentioning is the sectarian nature or the diversity within Syria. Unlike in Egypt, where 90% of the population is Sunni, there's a small Coptic community. Syria has 65% that is Sunni Arab, 12% that is Alawi, which is a Shia sect, 10% that are ethnic Kurds, 9% that's Christian, and 3% that's Druze. And this has left the Syrian revolt much more vulnerable to attempts by both the regime and countries from the Gulf to move it in a sectarian direction. And actually both would like this to happen. Assad's regime has characterized the opposition as sectarian, as extremists who would no sooner take power than slaughter the Alawis and the Christians, in hopes of actually keeping them loyal to the regime, or at least having them sit on the sidelines. And this is despite from the very beginning that there were Alawi dissidents and Christian dissidents that had expressed support to the opposition, and with Alawis actually participating in demonstrations in Damascus and Aleppo. Saudi Arabia, likewise, has been using its media outlets, most notably by broadcasting extremist firebrand Sheikh Adnan Arur, who has made the killing of Alawi minorities actually halal in Islam, meaning that it's okay, this is what he says on his TV program, to kill members of the Alawi sect within the confines of the conscript. So this is the kind of sectarianism that Saudi Arabia is trying to fuel in that direction. And it's very clear why Saudi Arabia wants to do this, because a revolution in Syria that has at its goal a democratic state, social reforms and so on, is not going to be subservient to the policies of Saudi Arabia. And moving the revolution in a sectarian direction gives Saudi Arabia the opportunity to actually pull off a section of the opposition. It's worth noting that a very tiny minority of Syrians actually are in support of policies that Arur. There have been some sectarian killings that have occurred. There have been some sectarian chants, but this is by and large not what the majority of Syrians demand when they go out. Most of the opposition groups have clearly stated that the revolution doesn't have a sectarian aspect to it, that they want a civil state with equality for all its members. And with the little time I have left, I'm going to go into the other aspect that's changed, which is we saw the regime in Syria actually learn from the revolutions in Egypt and from the revolution, the uprising that happened in Bahrain. One thing that they learned is you repress your people, and there's a very large possibility that you can actually stay in power. And despite now the Syrian regime's claims that the West is right, they're right in the sense that the Western media and Al Jazeera aren't focusing on Bahrain. What is really contradictory in that, or hypocritical, is that the Syrian regime actually came out in favor when the repression of the Bahrain protesters happened by Saudi Arabia. The Syrian regime put out a statement saying they support this, that this was in the right of Saudi Arabia and the Bahraini regime to do to counter the elements of disturbance in their country. Obviously, with the aim that they're hoping that they can do the same without with the support of these regimes. It's also worth noting that the regional and international powers who are just as opposed to the popular revolutions in the Middle East, as the national ruling classes of each state have also learned how to react to these revolutions. So it's not just the Assad regime that has learned, but the United States has learned how to help stop these revolutions, and so have the regimes of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, who are certainly against them because they have stirrings in their own countries. The Arab Spring, the revolutions have been an absolute earthquake for U.S. imperialism. They've lost one of their largest allies in Egypt, a longtime ally with Ben Ali, and most dangerous of all, they have the beginnings that this can actually spread to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, to the countries that are most important that they want to continue under U.S. domination. If we combine this with the forced withdrawal of the United States from Iraq, as well as the defeat, at least political defeat, of Israel in Lebanon in 2006, we actually see a situation where the U.S. power was beginning to diminish in the region. And consequently, U.S. policy advisors believe that this was to the advantage of Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah, who were benefiting from this. And this has led the U.S. To a scramble to maintain its hegemony and its dominant position in the region. They've tried several different ways to do this. The Egyptian model, which is you support the dictator until you can't support the dictator, and then you support the new dictator in the form of the military regime. In Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, they used a different model, which is don't mention the repression, ignore it, and allow your dictator to stay in power with your support. The Yemeni model has actually fallen somewhere in between, which is to continue to support the repression while the U.S. and its allies actually negotiate a change to the head of the regime, but still maintaining it in power. And in many ways, the Libya model has been the most important model for the U.S., not because of what a lot of people put forward, which is the U.S.'s ability now to control the resources of Libya, which I think they're certainly thinking about, but more importantly because this was a way for the U.S. to rehabilitate its ability to intervene in the region. The U.S. had completely lost that ability, this idea that they were the ones bringing forward democracy to the region after the debacles in Iraq, and after people saw what a real, genuine democratic revolution looks like in the Middle East. This was their opportunity to actually rehabilitate the humanitarian intervention doctrine. As some policy advisors called this was an opportunity for reset in the region. In all cases, the U.S. has believed that the revolutions cannot be trusted to the people who, of course, would support neither the U.S.'s political or economic imperatives in that region. And it's also worth stating that this is all happening within, at the same time that the U.S. is doing a shift in its actual larger strategy in controlling the region, as well as its larger strategy for military dominance across the world. And this is moving from a situation where the policy of actually attacking, bringing in large armies, and controlling places like Iraq and Afghanistan, to a policy that's been dubbed offshore balancing. This is due largely to the inability of the U.S. to fund major ground invasions, due to the constraints of the economic crisis. We hear the talk of the budget crisis. And of course, due to the lesson of their failures in Iraq and Afghanistan that they've suffered so far to secure victory. And it's also due to another reason, which is the need for the U.S. to shift military resources to challenge what they see as a rising China in the Southeast. And Obama specifically said, he came out with this back in January, Obama said that the new strategy would increasingly focus on Asia, stating in an address titled The Defense Strategic Review, quote unquote, that we'll be strengthening our presence in the Asia Pacific and budget reductions will not come at the expense of this critical region. So what the U.S. is actually beginning to shift towards, this policy of offshore balancing, is more a reliance on things like drone attacks. We see them in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Yemen, as well as naval power and air power, as we saw the reliance of the U.S. Air power in the situation in Libya, where they intervened. It also has another aspect, which is a larger reliance on the U.S.'s regional allies as proxies to achieve their goals and to balance the region. So we see a larger reliance on Europe for military power. We saw France and Italy, the UK taking a larger role in the bombings of Libya. We've seen Saudi Arabia and Qatar, as well as Turkey, taking on larger roles for the U.S., both militarily with Qatar participating in the bombing of Libya, with Saudi Arabia being used to quash the revolt in Bahrain, but also on the diplomatic and financial fronts to fund some of the resistance. And of course, it's well worth saying that these countries are more than happy to actually play this role at this situation, because they see this as an opportunity to reposition themselves in a more favorable position within the regional U.S. border. Am I way over time? I am.
This is a lot of good information.
I'll end very quickly. So how does Paul play Syria? Oh Jesus, man! What was I thinking?
It's a very complicated issue, which I'm drilling into.
It's your time, Wael. Go for it.
Who wants to give him a few more minutes? Raise your hand.
Yeah.
Okay. So how has this played out specifically in Syria? In many ways, the situation in Syria is unique, not only for the reasons which I described earlier, but also because the way that the Syrian Revolution has played out in the international arena, which I'm going to explain. The first thing that we could say about how U.S. policy has gone dealing with Syria is that they took a stance of, we're going to wait, just like they did with Egypt, and wait to see if Bashar al-Assad can hold on to power. Several weeks into the start of the protests on March 28th, Clinton was asked if the U.S. was considering a Libya-style intervention. She said no. Each of these situations is unique. What's happening there the last few weeks is deeply concerning, but it's different from aircraft attacks and indiscriminately killing people. She went on to say the main difference was that Bashar was a reformer. That was the reason for not taking a stand on that. And I think we have to figure out what the real reason is. Now, while Bashar al-Assad is certainly not the favorite or most pliant dictator to the United States in the region, and has been a thorn in the side of the U.S. Attempts to dominate the region, he's also been extremely helpful in other regards to U.S. imperialism on several occasions, from the support for the U.S. invasions of Iraq in the 1990s, to actually supporting the U.S. war on terror by torturing civilians who were renditioned to Syria. And of course, most importantly of all, despite a lot of rhetoric, the Syrian border with Israel has been quiet. As Asad Abu Khalil likes to say, who'll be giving a talk on a similar subject later, not a single bullet has been fired on the borders with Israel since 1973. So that was the first attempt of the U.S. But as the protests actually continued and intensified, and Bashar's chances of surviving became less certain in the eyes of the U.S., it actually cast about trying to find some section of the opposition that it could bring into its fold and ensure its compliance to the U.S. in the event of the regime falling. The SNC, which is the Syrian National Council, has been more than willing to be that section of the opposition. Mostly, the SNC is made up of exiles who were exiled, like I said, in the 1980s after Hama, as well as liberals who have some connections to sections of the Syrian capitalist classes who are actually funding the opposition. They have a minimal social base in Syria, and for these reasons, they are seeking Western sponsorship. because they don't have the social base to actually bring them into power upon a successful revolution. They have voiced support also for a pro-U.S. orientation in the region if they're helped brought into power. Skip. Okay. They've also gone on a national tour in the U.S. trying to solicit intervention. In this room, actually, about 3 months ago, Radwan Ziada, a prominent member of the Syrian National Council, went on a speaking tour across the U.S. To plead for U.S. intervention. And by October, U.S. calls for the Assad regime to step down and had actually begun to change its tune on Syria. They recalled their ambassador, and they began to give recognition to the Syrian National Council, and this followed with their allies. Of course, we've seen a huge amount of hypocrisy in this whole thing, where Syria is focused on, while, as we said, Bahrain is ignored. And I mean, the whole idea that the United States has the interests of the people of the Middle East at heart and is going to bring democracy to the region is absolutely absurd. We don't have to go into the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost in Iraq, or to the support for the Israeli occupation that has continued. Not to mention the fact that the U.S. can't even handle protests at its own public parks right now and is shutting them down. So take that into account. And they've also done this, this attempt to make intervention something that they'd like to do by ignoring the National Coordination Committee for Democratic Change inside Syria, which has stated over and over again that it's against intervention. It's made up largely of nationalists and leftists, but it's also worth saying that they're not largely connected to the mass of the protests in Syria. But nonetheless, the U.S. is trying to just make it seem as if the SNC is the only viable opposition there. And that's largely for their support for intervention. So where are we at right now? This is where I'll actually end. We saw the U.S. The U.S. is not convinced yet that it wants to go into an intervention in Syria because of a whole host of issues that have come up. One is it's actually they tried to lay the groundwork for something like this in the United Nations Security Resolution denouncing Syria, but Russia, which has its only port in the Mediterranean, which is located in Tartus on the coast of Syria, which is very important for it, actually vetoed it, along with China, who's using this as an opportunity to thwart U.S. efforts to extend its hegemony in the region. And they've really gone back to the drawing board in some ways. Just a couple days ago, I think yesterday, they put forward this Friends of Syria group in Tunisia, which is actually largely made up of what seemed like more the former colonists of Syria. The Syrian regime is the one that used this, but I actually think it's fairly, it actually is fairly accurate. And the official statement demanded an immediate ceasefire and allowance for humanitarian aid. But what seems to be the real consensus among the powers, France, we are talking about Saudi Arabia, the U.S., is actually to arm a section of the opposition and to begin to arm it. France has called for it, and of course the longtime friends of Syria and people in general of the region, John McCain and Joe Lieberman, have come out in support of this and issued a statement because the slaughter in Syria, they say, is unacceptable, because I'm sure that's what they're really worried about. And in this process also, the National Coordinating Council has been ignored, which has put out a statement that they're boycotting this because of these attempts to arm a section of the opposition. I really need to wrap up. How do we do that? Okay, so this is what I'll end with. It's worth noting, I think, that arming the Syrian Revolution, that can be the beginning of a way to see a Western intervention in the region. And it's also going to be very dangerous for the Syrian people themselves. Despite what's being said, it would lead to more deaths, not less, as it further militarizes the conflict. It could possibly lead to the destabilization of Syria and an actual civil war. And of course, it's going to lead groups inside Syria, real activist protesters, and the opposition on more reliance of foreign powers for their interests, both for the need to bring in weapons, which cost money, as well as the logistical support that's required for something like taking on the Syrian army and the strategy. Now, I want to be clear, I don't think this is to say that the Syrians who have taken up arms are not justified in doing so. The regime has been absolutely brutal in its repression of the people of Syria. They've used tanks on cities and so on. But what I'm saying here is to actually have arming a section of the opposition and having a full strategy based on militarization is very, very dangerous. Not least of which because it's going to end any of the mass protests and popular mobilization that's going to happen. Just like happened in Libya, people will go home because they won't be able to participate in that kind of thing. And despite what we're seeing, protests, mass protests are continuing, especially in places like Damascus. There was just a massive protest in Mesre and in Hama. And this is the way to actually bring the real end of the regime while keeping this revolution in the hands of the Syrian people. And I'll stop there.
Wow. I think Wael, this is why I love that I'm involved with Super, because he does an excellent job of leadership, but he managed to cover a very complicated topic that the traditional U.S. media is just really not covering very well. I think now would be an excellent time to also give a plug for our local radio station, KBOO. If you do not listen to Democracy Now! Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. or 4 p.m., they are covering Syria in a couple of different ways. And also, well, maybe there's a couple of different websites specifically about Syria that people can get good information on that you might want to share at the end. Okay. We're a little bit shorter for time. We're going to have about 45 minutes, but I think this is just, there's a lot of information as far as Syria goes, so I think it's good to let you go on. So the way it's going to work, as I said before, we want to kind of create a conversation and a discussion in a respectful way. This is kind of a hot topic, and I realize there's some complicated issues, but please be respectful of the people that are talking as well as the speaker. We'll give you about 2 minutes, and then I may ask you to wrap it up if you go on. I know you probably have a lot of thoughts on this subject. What I think might work best is take 3 of you at a time. We may not get to everybody. I apologize for that, but if you find someone that said something interesting, run into them at lunchtime, have a conversation. Maybe they're doing a talk later. Catch it that way. So I'll make eye contact with you. Like I said, I'll take 1, 2, and 3 hands. Make sure that I see you. And then we'll have Wael kind of make a comment, kind of maybe put those ideas together, and then we'll move forward. So let's see. Let's take our first 3 people. Okay. Who's this? Okay. All right. Go ahead.
Okay. Wael, that was a dynamite 101. 102 really cursor on Syria. Thanks for that. There's about 20 questions I could ask, but I'll try to narrow it down to solve it. Just to recap, you kind of got to it at the end there. What do you suggest needs to happen?
Okay. Go ahead, sir, in the group.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned that 50% of Syria were 18 and under. What happened to the adults? Was it from revolt and stuff like that they got killed off, or what? Question.
Yeah. Well, if you could just, I sort of always get confused. If you could just sort of lay out the relationships and sort of the strategies or the thinking, Iran, Lebanon, and Syria, kind of the interconnection.
Okay, well.
Yeah. So I'll start with the first question, which is, or your question on in terms of young people. It's not anything specific to Syria. It's actually a larger geographic trend that we see in the region and Egypt and lots of parts of the developing world, and has a pretty complicated history that includes the way that the economy is developed in relation to the capitalist power structures in the United States, and that would take me another hour to go through. But the idea of what if Russia and China had voted the way we want them to, and I'm not necessarily sure that that's the right way to frame it, because I mean, by default, I think this veto has in a way given the Syrian the people on the ground in Syria breathing room before the U.S. Because it's put a stumbling block in the path of the United States some time before they've been able to really lay out what they want to do, which is to arm sections of the population. Now, that's to say that I think the larger powers actually, the U.S., as well as China and Russia, aren't going to be the solution for Syria in any way. The real way forward for Syria is for the struggle to continue to be taken up by the Syrian people, and I think the way forward for that is it's not clear. Syria, like I said, is suffering to a large extent from what some of the other revolutions are suffering from, which is, although Egypt and Tunisia had a more developed political leadership and organizations, they're still very far behind in the game to kind of match and channel and organize the high-level, spontaneous, mass participation. And honestly, we're seeing that here in the United States too, with the Occupy movement to a large extent as well. So this is something that a lot of people are dealing with, and the Syrian Revolution is suffering from that as well. I mean, I personally think the way forward is for a way for the people of Damascus and Aleppo to actually be activated into mass protest. But I also think another aspect, which is we need to have actually workers' action in Syria as well. There's large industry, which is mostly based in the capitals of Aleppo and in Damascus. And like I said, what was crucial for the revolution in Egypt was the shutting down of of those points of production, which essentially forced, as the ruling the ruling elite in Egypt was forced to actually push Mubarak aside. This is the situation that I believe has to develop in Syria to really provide the ability to end the regime. Now, it's difficult because, like I said, leftist nationalist organizations aren't really developed. The Muslim Brotherhood is not really on the ground and organized like they were in Egypt. But we can hope that this opening has actually that this provides an opening in the cities for organization to continue and for political groups to emerge that can kind of provide that leadership, and I think put forward economic and social demands in Syria that can win a larger percentage of the population in the capitals to doing that. And I think we also have to look at it in the regional context, which is a large part of how the revolutions move forward depends also on how things develop in Egypt as well.
So I already have two people on the queue. You want to go after? Okay, so we'll have Michelle, and then this gentleman, I forgot your name, the gray hat, and then we'll have you. Okay? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I'll get back to that. Sorry.
Oh, was there another question? Okay. I'm going to add that too. Okay.
Yeah, my question is regarding the refugee populations in Syria, namely the Palestinian and Iraqi refugees. And one, how large are those populations in terms of demographics? And what role do they have in the revolt?
Okay. Sure.
So, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question of the UN Security Council is just I mean, basically the international community once again proving that it's completely impotent even in taking actions to just denounce the fact that a dictatorship basically is killing its own people. But apart from that, there's been some talk about sort of an association of other Arab countries providing arms and funding to some of the rebel groups, and I just wonder how they would orient themselves and where that would actually be going in Syria, like which group they would choose to fund, and how what they want to get out of that.
One of the things that's puzzled me the most about the situation in Syria is that the nature of the character of Bashar al-Assad himself. He came to power as a reluctant leader originally. I think he was in England. He was studying to be an ophthalmologist. He really seemed to have no interest in politics, and then his father died, and he was sort of pressed into service, taking his father's place as head of the regime. And he seems to have a fairly gentle, soft-spoken kind of personality. And yet the regime he's the head of has become so incredibly brutal and murderous. And I'm just wondering, does he feel obliged to the memory of his father to stay in power and to exercise by proxy this incredible level of brutality against his own people? It just seems incongruous to me. And at one point he actually made a statement in a press interview that he seemed to imply that he had no control over what the military forces were doing, that they were sort of acting on their own and almost seemed to try to evade responsibility for the actions of his own regime. And so I'm wondering if you could comment on that factor as well.
Okay, so I'll take 3 more hands, and then I'll have Wael speak to the last 3 questions. Anyone else got? Okay.
What's the relationship with Jordan and
Oh, wait, sorry.
yeah,
So I'm going to let Wael, because we
sorry.
I apologize. Okay, so let Wael speak to the last 3 questions, and then I'll start with you after he kind of wraps that up.
Okay, so the refugees, both Palestinian and Iraqi, the Palestinian refugees make up about 700,000 refugees in Syria. And I think the Iraqi refugees were about 1 million or 2. I'm not sure how many are still in Syria. I think it's around 1 million refugees. I actually don't have much knowledge about what the situation is in regards to the Iraqi refugees. In that context, I do know that the regime, the government in Iraq has largely supported the Syrian government. In this process, they've opened up their borders and continue to provide support and are trading with Syria and kind of rebuffed this U.S. effort to cut off trade. They've also made statements in support of Syria. I don't know how that plays with refugees. That's just the government there, and obviously that's connected to Maxine's question, which she posed earlier, around what is the relationship of Iran, Lebanon specifically, Hezbollah, and the Syrian situation. And like I mentioned earlier, the U.S., Israel, Saudi Arabia sees Iran, Syria, and Hezbollah as, to a large, to some extent, standing in the way of its policies. Noam Chomsky had an interesting point when yesterday he talked about around this, which is the point is to try to isolate Iran, to break Syria away from Iran, to cut that link with Hezbollah, but not really necessarily for any dangers they pose to Israel or regional dominance as it stands, but because they really want to be able to continue to isolate Iran and possibly destabilize the Iranian regime and help in regime change there. Again, Iran sits on large reserves of oil, is a regional power of sorts. And the connection to Iraq is that since the failure, to a large extent, not complete, but in a lot of ways, the U.S. has been defeated in Iraq in significant ways. They tried to extend their forces. They have failed. They failed to do so. The media says that they withdrew from Iraq. actually, the U.S. was forced out of Iraq by the government there, and Iran has actually had a larger, a gaining influence in Iraq at the expense of the Americans, obviously, as the Shia population came to power in that region. So that's some of the connection. The Palestinian refugee question is actually interesting, largely because there were these protests at the, if we remember at the beginning of when the protests began in Syria, there were actually protests inside the camps. First there were the protesters that tried to march on Nakba Day, the day that commemorates the Palestinian ethnic cleansing from Palestine, who tried to march back to their homes, who were Palestinian refugees living in Syria, and there's been two kind of debates as to what that situation was all about. One side says that it was Bashar al-Assad trying to use the Palestinians to kind of deflect attention away from the internal struggles and kind of put it on Israel. The other side, and I think Bashar, you know, the regime there in Syria had that in mind, but it actually shows that when protests happening, you begin to lose control over your constituencies, and it opens up these opportunities for real resistance to Israel. It's also worth noting that just recently Hamas has moved out of its base out of Syria, and has endorsed the Syrian Revolution for a long time. Hamas was fairly neutral and mum about what was going on. Now they've come out in full support. The Assad regime had requested that Hamas hold, about a month ago, that Hamas hold solidarity rallies with the regime inside the refugee camps for the Syrian regime, and they refused. So that's kind of some of those dynamics. I think Hamas, like some of the other forces, see that the Syrian regime's fortunes are falling. They don't want the Palestinian cause to be seen as... A set of Palestinian intellectuals actually published a statement, not in our name, because the Syrian regime is trying to use the completely legitimate the completely legitimate feelings of the Syrian people and of the Arab world against the continued Israeli occupation, and tried to use the Palestinian issue as a way of smashing the opposition. And Palestinian intellectuals have come out and put out a statement, not in our name. And similarly, Palestinian, I think, leadership is moving in a direction where they don't want to be associated with that kind of with a regime that they see falling. What groups would they fund? I don't think they know yet. I think it's a really interesting point to bring up, because this is part of, I think, this is part of the uncertainty that came out of this Friends of Syria talk. It seems, you know, the statement that they put out is they'll get funded somehow by somebody. That's what that's what Hillary Clinton put forward. And what they said was that the Syrians need to there needs to be some unity among the opposition, so that, you know, before we start arming. You know, I think the real question is they're not sure who to arm, because the Syrian National Council doesn't have the real support on the ground. It doesn't exert very much pressure. It helps managing the Facebook page, and obviously has become the international voice of it and has connections. But they don't control neither the protesters nor the armed elements that have emerged in Syria. And frankly, a lot of the interviews with people who are armed, you know, they're being portrayed by the Syrians as being dupes of the West and yada yada yada. They've been very clear. It actually struck me from the interviews as well as some of the YouTube videos I've watched that they almost hold the Syrian National Council in contempt to a certain extent. One said that if these people try to come and take power, you know, after the revolution, you know, I think one of them said, "I'll shoot him," or something like that. That's an anecdote, but I think it's actually representative that the message is not clear. The large part of there is no central leadership to the armed elements in Syria. People are largely fighting neighborhood battles against the regime that's attacking them, and the U.S. is is very worried, is not clear about who they're going to fund and what that's going to look like and if that's going to guarantee. They're certainly searching, and that's the option that they want to move forward, because the other option, which I mentioned, which is for this to continue and the possibility of an actual mass protest movement continuing in Syria is not an option for them, because they lose control of the situation in that sense. And last question on Bashar al-Assad, why has he stayed in power? You know, I think one way to answer that, in some regards, you know, he's right, and you know that he doesn't have much power. I mean, it's not that he doesn't have much power, but like any country, there are people around him. He still has, like I mentioned, a social base in the country, especially in Damascus. Among some of the capitalist classes have continued to support him. The merchant classes in Damascus, there was a call for merchants to shut down their shops in Damascus, which was rejected, unlike other parts of the country where it's actually happened. And I think we have to talk about the way the Syrian, the way that the Syrian regime has maintained power is by placing Alawi, certain sections of the Alawi community in positions of power within the military. In officer positions, as well as within key positions within the bureaucracy. And this exerts a real pressure on the regime to actually to stay in power, because it's not just, you know, in a large part, their legitimacy, they view their power as their ability to stay in power as coinciding with Bashar al-Assad. That if they lose Bashar al-Assad, with the sectarian element that can't be you know, denied, that they're actually going to possibly, you know, face reprisals. And I think that's part of the reason that it's been more difficult to kind of just remove the leader and have the same old regime, because there is this other element to it that, and I want to be clear, it's not the Alawi community at large that has a privileged position within Syrian society. It's very, very specific elements that the regime has actually elevated into key security positions to maintain their dominance. And the broader Alawi community is actually concerned because they've been used in that way. And you know, in a situation like this, there can't be but some resentment, you know, against that. So that's, I think, some of the worries and dynamics that are going on there.
Okay, so we have a little under 10 minutes until the lunch break. I've got 3 people on my stack, so I think it'll probably take 1 or 2 more people. If you have extremely pressing questions, I already have you. Is there any 1 or 2 last people that want to get a question in? I have you. Okay, and then I'll add you and anyone else. One last question? Anyone? Okay, so you'll be first, and then you'll be next, and then I'll take you. Okay, so go ahead.
Alright, so I just had a very basic question on how the Jordanians and the government of Israel itself and what their take is on what's happening in Syria.
Yeah, I have a question. Can you talk a little bit about the use of nonviolence in Syria against the regime? Because I know that I've been to countless demonstrations, and I've been thrown down by the cops. I've been handcuffed by the cops, pepper sprayed, concussion grenades, tear gas, high frequency grenades, cannons, and all that stuff that so many of us have experienced at demonstrations. But the thing with me is I do believe in nonviolence in this country, but however, I don't find myself going home to my house and the entire house is gone because 155mm howitzer rounds have been fired into it and my wife and children aren't dead, which is what is happening in Syria. So there is a difference. We say nonviolence and we just kind of breeze it off. Oh, it's just a real simple thing that just comes out of our mouth. But these people, when they go home, these people are facing unbelievable terrorism, And I was wondering if you could kind of explore that a little bit about,
Yes, and question.
Yeah, the Alawites drink wine and don't pray 5 times a day or have mosques and some things that are very objectionable to some of the other Syrians. And during the Hafez regime, they massacred 70 young Alawite cadets. They made 3 major assassination attempts on the convoys of Hafez. And they did constant atrocities during that period of time, and they were well armed to do so. And so I think that that's enough. That religious difference is probably enough to cause a lot of trouble.
Okay, so the last question from you, and then I think what I'll have. Did you want to still ask your question? Was it you? Yeah. And then I think what I'll have you do is wrap up since we're getting close to time. Okay. Our last question then.
Yeah, so my question is, throughout your talk you've mentioned Egypt as sort of the military situation. So my question is, you don't want Syria to turn to this, well, we'll just take the next regime, which happened in Egypt. You also don't want the situation of Tunisia where the people have just sort of been ignored. And then you have the situation of Libya where we came in. So, I mean, this is the impossible question, but it sort of ties in with the nonviolence. It's like, in terms of, do we arm in any sort of situation? Is that a possibility for success? Because in terms of just keeping up with protests, do you truly believe that if there just is consistent protest, that will actually eventually change?
Great question. Yeah. So real quick on Jordanian and government of Israel. Jordanian government largely follows the dictates of the U.S. government. The U.S. government is trying to ratchet up pressure, obviously, on the Assad regime. Jordanian government's allowed, allowed protests on the borders of Israel and so on and so forth. Israel at first was also very ambivalent for some of the reasons that I explained earlier about what it means for a mass popular revolution to sweep through Syria, and for the reasons that since 1972, not a single bullet has been fired on its border. Its border has been sealed and not porous, and they have legitimate concerns in that regard. Since then, I think they similar to the United States, have seen that in all likelihood the Syrian regime is the Syrian regime may not survive, or is not going to survive, and along with the U.S. Are searching for specific elements within the opposition that are going to support the U.S. policies in the region, which prioritize continuing support for Israel's dominance of the Palestinians and its continuing occupation of Arab lands. So that's kind of where Israel is at. I want to talk real quick about this question of sectarianism, because I think we have to be careful when we say they. We're talking about something that happened in the 1980s with a very specific group within the Muslim Brotherhood, and even a faction within the Muslim Brotherhood, which has a lot of disagreement. So I don't think we could take that specific example and then generalize it to the opposition, to the people on the streets, to the majority of the Syrian opposition. With that said, there are sectarian tensions. There have been, some sectarian reprisal. This is a worry, absolutely. And one of the ways forward, I think, for the Syrian revolt is to continue as the groups on the ground, as well as the leadership, to denounce sectarianism. So I agree, but I don't think we can generalize that.
But
I think
incident always comes up as though it happened in a vacuum. It's always raised. You raised it, the Hafez thing in '82, And it's always raised as though it just happened in a vacuum. They went out one day and decided.
I mean, I think, like I said, when I put it into context, it's, I mean, first off, when the reprisal of Hafez al-Assad was not simply against the armed elements of the Muslim Brotherhood that had done this. Like I said, he leveled the city, a part of the city of Hama, killing 10 to 20,000 people, including Alawis, Christians, and other people in the area. And he took advantage of that to actually go ahead and repress the leftists and nationalists. So I don't think that's actually a justification for that horrible kind of repression. And I also think it's worth noting that the regime itself is stoking sectarianism, as we mentioned. That is the direction they want the revolution to move forward, because they know if that's the way that things go forward, then they have large sections of the population, minorities, that are going to be afraid to actually participate in the revolution. So I think that's a very clear. That's the response to that. And I think we'll kind of end on this use of nonviolence and I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think we can't condemn the use of people who are fighting for their lives to pick up a weapon when tanks have surrounded their cities, when there has been absolute brutalization. And I think people have the right to do that. That is very different, and I think we have to be very clear, from supporting a policy that takes that as a strategy for the way that the Syrian Revolution moves forward with the help of Western, with the West arming it. I think that will be a recipe actually for disaster in the region. And so there's that. I think the last part too on what do we do? Do we arm? I mean, I think we have to really, think about that. Who is we? Is it the group of people here who are, concerned about the future? We're talking about, the United States, which has a historical record of dominating the region, murdering large numbers of people in Iraq, supporting a vicious Israeli government, and that is interested in dominating that region. So I think that's the people that are going to be arming and doing the arming. So how can we actually provide solidarity here in the United States? What is it that we can do? And I think one of the first things that we have to do is separate two things out, which I've tried to do, which is actually to help try to open up this new framework, which is to de-link support for the revolution and the people of Syria for support for Western intervention. I think that has to be very clear. The other part is to de-link opposition to intervention in our discussions from support from the Assad regime. This has been the way that things have been framed, and I think we have to be very careful, because a lot of the people, especially Syrians, who support intervention don't do so because they support Western domination of Syria. They're doing that because they are seeing their brothers, their sisters, their families get killed in the region. So I think we have to have a patient conversation there. And vice versa, I think we don't, that doesn't mean we don't challenge those ideas. I think we have to challenge those ideas. We have to be for the Syrian Revolution and against Western intervention. And I think we have to do one last part, which is we have to also realize that the Syrian people and the Arab people in the region are actually, they have several enemies, if you will, that they're fighting on this plane in their continued revolutions. One, of course, is their national and regional ruling classes that want to stop these popular revolutions in their track and want to stop them from deepening and turning into social revolutions that demand a complete, change of the economic and political system. The other enemy that they have on the field are the United States, the U.S. and the Western powers, which are also trying to stop that and trying to regain control of the region. This is where we can actually play a large part. I think we need to actually support movements here in the United States, like the Occupy movement, like workers' struggle. We need to build an anti-war movement that actually forces the United States to bring those their troops, to bring those resources home, and end its domination, and actually remove one of the largest obstacles for the Syrian revolutions from the playing field in that region. That's the way forward for us.